Welcome to University of Buckingham, Money, Banking and Financial Markets, Summer Term, July to September 2020. The course is taken by me, Brian Sturgess, Chief Economist, World Economics, although I have spent many years working in investment banks and in financial markets. But if we can continue. Well, first, before we start the first lecture and the course, just a slide to remind you that despite lectures being online, the student experience at Buckingham is still here for you, and some information and contacts, phone numbers, emails, and so on, Facebook and Instagram, about the Students' Union, Career Service, Student Conduct, and Student First. An introduction to the contents of this course. In week 1, we'll be talking about money, the nature of money, a very, very brief history, and then theories on the demand for money and definitions of the supply of money. Week 2, we will look at interest rates, theory of determination of interest rates, the term structure of interest rates, bond yields, and so on. In week 3, we will look at banks and their role in the creation of credit and money. Week 4, we will look at the role of central banks in controlling the supply of money, and again their role in monetary markets and regulation. Week 5, we will look at financial intermediaries in the financial process. Week 6, we will look at financial markets and financial instruments. Week 7, we will analyse and do a brief history of financial crises and regulation, attempts to try and control financial crises and how that's evolved. Week 8, we will look at international financial markets, and in week 9, we will review some monetary controversies about the role of money and how there are still many unresolved issues and what is likely to happen in the next couple of years in the light of the massive expansion of money which is seen in response to the COVID-19 crisis. Recommended reading for the course. The following textbook is recommended. Frederick Mishkin Pearson, not Perrison, 12th edition, 2019. But if you use any other editions, they should generally be fine, but attention must be paid to the chapter's numbers. And of course, keep up to date with reading in The Economist and other financial newspapers, such as the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal. Other useful reading, Robert Skidelsky, Money and Government, A Challenge to Mainstream Economics, which actually looks at money more from a Keynesian than a monetarist perspective, to give some balance. But each week, additional readings on each topic, articles and other relevant issues will be placed upon Moodle. Well, let's start with the first week. We'll look at the nature of money. We'll discuss the demand and supply functions for money. So the contents of Lecture 1, reading is Mishkin Chapter 3 and the other readings of Shepherd and Model. We'll first look at the nature of money itself. Second, we'll look at the demand for money, then the supply of money. Well, let's consider what the institution of money is. Basically, money, as used, is a social institution. It's not a physical phenomenon. It's social, like language or law. Since its existence, which again is not fully known when money started, many theories about it, but governments or states have tried to control the use of money through the mint right through to central banks. It's social because we accept money for what it is, and we use it because it's accepted by other people. Money is, of course, a fundamental institution of markets. Money replaces barter, as markets have replaced barter. Barter, of course, needs a double coincidence of wants. Money reduces transaction costs and the time taken to find desired goods for exchange in a barter economy. What does a double coincidence of wants means? It means, for example, if I'm a tailor and I produce suits, I may have an excess supply of suits. I only want to wear one myself, and I want to use those to barter for, say, food. Let's say lamb chops, which I'm particularly partial to. Now, unless I can find a farmer or a butcher, producer of lamb chops, who also wants a suit, then I have a problem. It needs to be that I need to find somebody where the wants are actually coincidental. Otherwise, I need to actually store my desire to barter in some product, which of course could, in this case, suits are tangible and will last. But if I was a fishmonger, I'm producing something which doesn't last. Therefore, if I don't find somebody who supplies me with what I want, technical starve. So, barter is complicated. It needs a double coincidence of wants. And also it involves high transaction costs because there may be time taken to find the desired goods that we want to exchange with what we've produced, presuming again that we can actually, we're producing something perishable which will last until we find somebody to exchange it with. Money, of course, gets around all this problem. And instead of the price of suits in terms of fish, the price of fish relative to bottles of wine relative to suits and all sorts of other products, there's only the price of every product in terms of a unit of money. So it reduces the actual informational needs, meaning the price lists are much more easy. Money could be a way of getting better bargaining because it's a generally accepted asset. You don't have to go through many of the processes of bargaining when you're bargaining with things which possibly people want less. Money is a custom. Again, it's a social institution, but it's an institution based on weak unanimity. Weak unanimity is two people at least agreeing and the rest abstaining. So as long as two people agree to exchange money, it will actually work. It's called unanimity nemine discrepante, with nobody disagreeing. The market in general, and money in particular, are part of a cooperative game. It can be looked at it from that perspective. So money is a customary institution. It reduces transaction costs, obviously facilitates exchanges, measures prices and obligations, debts, and this is why governments have been involved. It's a means of paying taxes, levies, etc., which are easier than actually paying taxes and levies in terms of products which may be perishable. Well, this position to exchange is seen as part of, anthropologically, as part of human behaviour. Adam Smith, could say one of the early founders of work on economics, talked about the human disposition to truck, barter and exchange in The Wealth of Nations in 1776. He explains the moving impulse of all economic institutions. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from the regard to their own self-interest. So it's the desire of people to satisfy their own wants is why they supply, and this is why they get involved in the exchange economy. A little bit later, in the early 19th century, French economist Say argued that money is only a means of payment. In other words, people don't want money for its own sake. It's only a means of actually they supply in the market to get money, to use that money for exchange. So something similar to a wagon that serves to transport commodities. It's an input into the process of a market economy. Many early societies developed forms of proto-money, which were basically commodities that everyone agreed to accept in trade. A number of examples: the Aztecs used cocoa beans, Vikings had used butter as a means of exchange, the Roman army quite often used salt, hence the name we still use salary. The American colonists used tobacco leaves, animal hides to trade with themselves and obviously with the Native Americans. China, India, Thailand and West Africa have been known to use cowrie shells. So many different forms of commodities which don't necessarily have any value, but are used as a form of to be used to accept as a form for trade. Who invented money? Well, we don't really know. But if other people don't accept it, we don't want it. It looks like a reason in circles, but it isn't. Money is very much an example of the theory of network goods. Karl Menger, the Austrian economist, 1840 to 1921, on the origin of money in 1892, he argued that a property-owned entrepreneur discovers that some goods are more acceptable than others to other people because they can use them in later exchanges. He or she then accumulates that good, perhaps it's copper, perhaps it's gold, not for their consumption, but to get a price when it's used for other purchases. And this allows bargaining, gets a lower price for other products. And the state's role eventually, as Menger saw, was to guarantee the valuable metal content in what is actually used as money, in either copper or gold or silver. We say governments because governments and money have always, at least in recorded history, had an important role. From the Roman Empire onwards, and before the Roman Empire in Republican Rome and into the Middle Ages, the coinage of money was an imperial or a kingly privilege. And now, of course, it's the privilege of the state. It used to be forgery was punished by death. Now, of course, it's punished by imprisonment. And there are certain features, brassage, which was a charge made to an individual under a system of free coinage for the minting of any gold or silver brought to the mint, and usually calculated by the mint to cover the various costs. In seigniorage, a government revenue from the manufacture of coins, calculated as the difference between the face value and the metal value of coins. And of course, this still exists as a means of earning revenue, with the difference between printing paper money and the actual cost of printing paper money. And of course, it's even bigger with the question of creating by a few strokes of a computer the creation of digital money and the cost of doing so, which is virtually zero. So governments have always been involved with money. Types of money we can define: commodity money, money that has an alternative use as an economic good or a commodity, and this of course includes metals, copper, gold, silver, and so on. And we talked about butter, we talked about salt, and so on. And fiat money, money which is money guaranteed by a government decree. This is anything which the government says is money, and it's backed by the government. And of course, this includes any paper money which is not backed by any commodity, which is only or metal, is only backed by um, the credit worthiness of the government issuing the fiat money. Metal is often called specie, and compare this with paper money. North America before the independence revolution. So specie is money in the form of gold or silver coins. It was at one point the most desirable form of money because of the mineral content and the limited supply of gold and silver, and the content of gold and silver in the coins. And you all come across the idea of debasing coinage, where governments quite often reduce deliberately the gold or silver content to try and increase the money supply and to debase the currency. In 1776, before the revolution of the colonies in North America, there was $12 million worth of coin versus circulating about $500 million worth in paper money. So a lot more paper money circulating than actually there was in terms of specie. What are the four main characteristics of money? Portability. It can be easily transferred from one person to another, and obviously from one bank vault to another bank vault. It makes the exchange of money for products easier. Durable. It does not deteriorate when handling and can be easily replaced. It's divisible. It should be able to be broken down to smaller units so that people can use only as much as needed for a transaction. Otherwise, we're back to a semi-barter economy again. Limited supply. Can't have too much of it because then obviously it will become worthless, so there has to be some limited supply. Obviously gold and silver were in limited supply, which is one of the reasons that particularly gold was actually used. When you have paper money, it's obviously not limited supply, but the supply becomes limited by a government monopoly over the production of money. Does modern money meet all these necessary requirements? Let's take just the US dollar, for example. Portability, yes, it's light in weight, convenient, easily transferable, easily put into a pocket or carried around. It's durable. Coins tend to last over 20 years. Paper currency lasts around about 18 months in circulation before being replaced. Now, of course, we have plastic paper money. Divisible. Penny is small enough for almost all purchases and can write checks, and you can write checks for exact amounts. The supply fluctuates, again controlled by the government, but it grew at about 10% to 12% in the 1970s, but for the most part it's been a stable and limited supply. Many theorists, like the monetarists, argue to actually grow the money supply at a particular fixed rate. Of course, now with COVID-19, we're seeing in the monetary response, we're seeing a very, very bigger growth in the supply of money. Well, what are the three main functions of money? First, it's a medium of exchange. We talked about the superiority of money exchange over barter exchange, and it's used for this in foreign transactions as well as domestic transactions. It's a unit of value, a numeraire. It can be used to measure and compare relative prices of goods and services. It can value assets, and also it can value liabilities. Assets, of course, are stores in monetary value which can be converted into other commodities through money, and liabilities, of course, are obligations, again valued in monetary terms, which need to be converted into into money to be before converted into other goods and services. It acts as a store of value. It keeps purchasing power for the future. Again, in the barter economy, we don't have to exchange. We don't have to hold on to fish before we can buy suits. Money acts as a store of value. Of course, there are some caveats in this, and because of inflation, but we'll talk about it later. But it acts as a store of value also when income and expenditure don't actually tally. So if income's higher than expenditure, money can be used as a store of value for savings. If expenditure is greater than income, then money, in a sense of debts, can be used as a store of value. What is then owed to other economic agents. So these are the three main functions: medium of exchange, unit of value, and the store of value. And you find this in all of the textbooks. Money, of course, is a stock. In macroeconomics and microeconomics, we talk about the difference between stock and flow variables. Economists make a distinction between money in the form of currency, coins and paper notes, demand and current deposits in banks, and other items that are used to make purchases and to store wealth. So the total collection of pieces of property that serve to store value. So it's a stock. Wealth includes not only money, but also other assets which an individual may own, for example bonds, common stock, art, stores of wine, land, furniture, cars and houses. So money is a part of wealth. It's a non-interest or non-yielding part of wealth. Income, of course, is a flow of earnings per unit of time, but money, in contrast, is a stock. It's a certain amount of money existing at a certain given point in time. We said it's a store of value, but money, of course, does have a value in terms of the goods and services you can buy, and the money supply and the value of money have been debated for some time. Particularly gold and silver going into the Spanish Empire from the discovery of Mexico and South America. As Bill Quetta, a Spanish friar in Manual de Confesores, 1559, touched on both the internal value of money and the rate of exchange of the currency. The value of money is the inverse of the price level. If the price of all goods and services goes up, the value of a stock of money goes down. And of course, what happened, gold and silver were pouring in from America, and this was causing rises in prices throughout Spain and the Netherlands and throughout other parts of Europe, which was, of course, reducing the value of the stock of money which was actually held. And it also affects the rate of exchange of the currency. He said the value of goods in hands, in other words labour, changes with the arrival of the precious metals. So the more precious metals they are, the impact on prices can reduce the value of money, which is the inverse of the level of prices. Gresham's law, another early thinker on money. Thomas Gresham, 1519 to 1579, argued that bad money expels good. Remember, this is the period when you were having Tudor monarchs debasing their coinage by actually reducing the amount of precious metals in the currency. Although sometimes good money expels bad, which is the inverse of Gresham's law. Gresham's law saw bad money, in other words money which had been debased, expelling good. The people would hold on to good money, in other words money which had a higher percentage of gold or silver, and spend quickly bad money, money which value was being reduced. But the inverse of Gresham's law is that sometimes good money can expel bad money. In other words, when people prefer to hold good money and use good money rather than bad money. When the rate of exchange between bad and good money is fixed by decree, then Gresham's law holds. Bad money expels the good. If exchange between good and bad money is free, then the inverse of Gresham's law rules. In this case, because if there's a rate of exchange between good and bad money, then the inverse will occur. In other words, good money will expel bad money. For example, in Zimbabwe during the periods of hyperinflation, the use of US dollars, which actually hold in value. Many years ago, I was in Turkey before the euro, and because of inflating value of the lira, most people wanted Deutschmarks rather than actually Turkish lira, even in domestic transactions. Well, in the history of money, it's worth spending some time in looking at the gold standard, and I recommend that you read up about it to some extent. It's not too important for this course, but the gold standard was obviously a means of actually tying monetary values to the value of gold, defined in 1717 by Isaac Newton, was the first master of the mint in England, or the United Kingdom, as England became just a few years before that. It evolved and grew in use during the 18th century, and the Bank of England had a note issue and a gold window where notes would be issued, but notes could be redeemed in terms of gold. It was suspended during the period of the Napoleonic Wars from 1798 to 1819, and again it's worth looking at that, less from this course, more from the history of banking and money. Generally, gold was used in Europe from 1871 until 2014. That's 1914. The gold standard was suspended in the United Kingdom when the First World War broke out, until 1925, when there was a decision, disastrous as it was, to go back to the gold standard, which caused deflation in prices. This experiment was ended in 1932, and in the 1930s many countries went off the gold standard. It's worth looking at bimetallism, in other words the use of silver and gold, the Latin monetary union in the 19th century. Again, the gold window at the Bank of England, the history of that, use of the discount rate, outside and inside drains of gold, attempts at revival of the gold exchange standard, but generally John Maynard Keynes thought that the use of gold was actually a primitive and medieval idea, in that it actually would restrict the expansion of money to the discoveries of the precious metal. In the after the Second World War, with the foundation of the Bretton Woods system in 1944, which we will look at in more detail. In the Bretton Woods system, there was a system of fixed exchange rates. Exchange rates were fixed to the US dollar, and the US dollar was fixed to a certain value of gold. Now this continued until the 1970s, when the system broke away, and the value of gold would be traded up and down on financial markets. And again, you can look at the history of the gold price and compare it to the history of currencies to see whether or not you would have been better storing your value in gold from the 70s onwards. And there are some people who still believe implicitly in gold, although we will not spend much time discussing that. The end of gold, after the end of the US being tied to a specific value of gold, the US was effectively from that point onwards what you call fiat money. So the US dollar, when Nixon decided to actually break the peg with gold, in other words, You couldn't no longer bring US dollars to the Federal Reserve and or to one of the departments and ask for the same value in gold. After that, the United States dollar became fiat money. In a sense, it was backed by the US government, and most other currencies have gone down the same route after the breakup of Bretton Woods. Fiat money is paper or electronic money issued by a central bank or a treasury and not linked in any way to any metal. Ideally limited by a rule, by issue, but again it's often at the request of a government or a central bank. It removes the hard discipline of the gold standard. Fiat money in the price level. Well, with fiat money, inflation can rise to any rate. Read some information on Zimbabwe. Hyperinflation is defined as more than a 50% increase in prices per month. When banknotes lose their convertibility to gold, what gives value to money? Again, not the backing of it with metal, land, or whatever, but acceptance by the public as being of use, and the limitation of its issue by the central bank, and as we will see also how it is actually used. So we'll study in this course the importance of the rules for central bank behaviour. Moving on, there's been a lot of technological change and moving to a cashless society. We've gone from commodity money to fiat money to obviously use of checks and electronic payments, e-money, debit cards, smart cards, e-cash. Read Michigan textbook pages 99 to 100. Obviously now we have Bitcoin and other private monies competing for use in competition with government monies. Refer you to Kevin Dowd, a monetary theorist, a pamphlet, New Private Monies, a Bit Part Player, IEA 2014. If you want to read up on this more. The demand for money. The idea that there are some theoretical determinants of the demand for money, and the demand for money is discoverable and possibly stable and determinant, owes a lot to the idea of monetarism, which we'll explore. But there are other theories about the demand for money, for example, the Keynesian liquidity preference, which we'll also explore. Well, the question, why do people want to hold on to money, apart from for a temporary measure? Well, Adam Smith saw money as a factor of production. A family or firm without liquidity, which is required in the form of money, will be in trouble if cash inflows don't tally perfectly with cash outflows. But since money, in the terms of coins or banknotes or held in bank accounts, produce services, for example liquidity and so on, but bears little or no interest, there is an opportunity cost in keeping it. Why do people keep it? There must be an optimal quantity of cash or optimal quantity of people's wealth in which people wish to hold in monetary form. So what do people do to manage their cash holdings, their real balances of money optimally? Well, it's quite often theorized that people find they hold an excess quantity of cash, they will spend it, and this could make prices rise. So cash balances, unfortunately, are one of the many things that governments can't govern. They can govern the amount of cash put into the system, but they can't govern the amount which people actually want to hold. So in order to model the demand for cash balances, which an economic agent, consumer or firm or anybody wishes to hold, First, it's important to define the functional relationship between money and prices, because the price level determines the inherent value of money. Well, the original quantity theory of money, which determined a fairly stable demand for money, has been proposed by many authors along the centuries. A Spanish author, Azpilicueta, linked money, the money supply, and in this case gold and silver coming from the Indies, but of course the Americas, with the domestic inflation in Spain and other parts of the empire, in the Netherlands, for example, and the rate of exchange. Present-day theories of exchange rates do suggest that currencies tend in the very long run to have equal purchasing power parities, as the theory for that, and therefore that relative inflation rates serve to predict exchange rates, but again also in the long run. Exchange dealers trading in the foreign exchange markets therefore compare rates of inflation, and they forecast consequent changes in interest rates for different currencies. Although, of course, trading in foreign exchange without knowledge is a quick way to lose a large amount of money. Well, the philosopher David Hume, who was a friend and influenced Adam Smith, talked about a specie floor mechanism, which is the ground base for the theory of the gold standard, but not of David Ricardo's later economist currency school tradition. David Hume saw the balance of trade as the regulator of a domestic money supply. If a domestic economy was booming, this would lead to a balance of payments deficits and therefore an export of gold. So there will be a shortage of gold, a run on gold reducing the monetary base, which would restrict the money supply and lead to the boom eventually weakening through an increase in interest rates. Similarly, a surplus would lead to an increase in gold, which would actually reduce interest rates and lead to a boom, which of course would lead possibly to a deficit and so on. So this was Hume's mechanism. Although, as Azpilicueta and another theorist, Borden, did not formulate it algebraically, they were looking at a fairly early version of the quantity theory of money, which is quite often best understood as an identity. M, which is the quantity of money. V, the velocity of circulation, which is the number of times money changes hands, is equal to P, the price of goods and services, and T, the number of transactions. This is reformulated by the American economist Irving Fisher, 1867 to 1947, as in terms of the price level. So the price level was equal to M multiplied by V divided by T. Now, if the level of transactions doesn't change much, and if the velocity of circulation V is fairly stable, this means there's a direct relationship between the price of goods and services, P, and M, the quantity of money. So this version, the Fisher version, shows that movements in the price level will result more or less directly, although it could take some time, from changes in the quantity of money. For a long time, and even continuing to this day, there is a debate about the neutrality or the non-neutrality of money. In other words, is money just a veil as a means of exchange and a store of value behind which transactions take place, or does it have an economic impact? Richard Cantillon, an Irish economist who spent a lot of time in France, born probably the 1680s to died in 1724 in a fire, de la nature de commerce en général. The Cantillon effect, inflation takes effect gradually and affects or falsifies the real economy. So money increasing inflation will not occur neutrally. It will have real impacts on the economy. In equilibrium, the effect of an increased money supply is halted by the Hume's specie flow mechanism. Hume, in his essays Moral and Political, argued for the temporary exciting effect of the supply of money. So the supply of money could have some sort of real impact, but then developed the idea of the specie flow mechanism, which shows that in equilibrium it will not have an impact at all apart from on prices. Well, three causes of retardation, in other words, is a slowing down of the direct impact from money supply to prices. There's a question about the speed of information about the increases in money supply. How quickly do people perceive that? Obviously, in periods of hyperinflation, information about money supply growth and people's expectations of inflation become much faster. So the role of expectations is important. Central banks watch whether or not inflation expectations are anchored. In other words, are based upon what is likely to happen or are distorted. But again, in hyperinflation, prices often forge far ahead even of the money supply growth, and cash and small change becomes scarce. So in other words, in this particular case, inflation is expected even before the money supply increase actually causes a change in inflation itself. Again, and also the Cantillon effect. The dynamic relationship between money supply and the change in prices, dP/dt, in other words, the change in prices over time, takes time to percolate. So they could be real impacts, and it's still a debate about how they work and how long they take. Some economists have seen money as a veil behind which a real economy operates. This is the traditional view of the classical school, especially Jean-Baptiste Say, who we mentioned earlier. In Say's law, the idea that supply creates its own demand. You only supply goods to buy other goods, and money is not for accumulation, it's just to allow you to buy those other goods. So in the long term, money is discounted and people govern themselves by real prices of the real economy. Of course, later in that century, in Walras and his idea of general equilibrium. In general equilibrium, it's relative prices which affect whether or not there's going to be a market clearing vector of prices in which all markets clear. In other words, a general equilibrium exists. There's no net demand for money, because relative prices can be defined in terms of money as one commodity or in terms of any other commodity, whether it be bottles of wine, cigarettes, cars, anything, or a combination of commodities. Hence, in the long term, money will not affect relative prices, which are what determines equilibrium, and things like equilibrium in the labour market, what is employment, equilibrium in the goods market, or in any particular market. Money has no role. In the long term, money is therefore neutral. The quantity theory owes a lot more to Irving Fisher, who was the first to define and call it the quantity theory of money. We described it a bit earlier, but let's look in more detail. He started off with the idea of the velocity of money. Initially, it was defined as the transactions velocity, let's call it VT. He formulated the exchange equation in terms of the nominal values of transactions in the economy, prices multiplied by transactions, as an identity, where P is the average price per transaction, T the number of transactions, and VT is nominal value of transactions divided by the money supply and is estimated to be constant. But of course, measuring the number of transactions is difficult, so Vy could be considered the income velocity. So in other words, using the concept of GDP or national income, call that Y instead of the number of transactions of goods and services. Then we have the income velocity, which is Vy, V multiplied by Y, which is aggregate output times some proportionality constant V, which again is assumed to be constant. This gives the relationship between the quantity of money and some income velocity multiplied by the nominal value of transactions. In effect, Irving Fisher's contribution was to turn the identity into a theory by making the effect of money on prices depend upon payment habits through an institutionally determined and then more or less stable V. That gave a quite mechanical result for the prediction of the movement of prices from the money supply. But we shall see that prices are not a function of the quantity of money in the short run, only in the long run. So better theory of the velocity of circulation is needed than Irving Fisher's approach. One approach was the Cambridge cash balance approach. Cambridge in England was the approach of Alfred Marshall, 1842 to 1924, and the work of Keynes, 1883 to 1946, especially in this earlier period. To model a velocity, it's best to assume that individuals and firms want to keep a stable proportion of their wealth in cash for liquidity needs and as a precautionary reason. Milton Friedman later developed the new quantity theory of money. Effectively, MV equals PT is the reduced equation of a model with two functions. One function is the function for the demand for money, and the other one is the supply of money. Friedman argued that the demand for money is an asset in the portfolio of individuals, which includes all sorts of other assets, other ways of storing wealth, stocks, bonds, real estate, etc. And this produces the arguments for the demand for money function, which we'll consider. The supply of money, Friedman proposed a very, very simple rule for fiat money. Friedman, like most later economists, was skeptical of the gold standard and was in favour of flexible exchange rates. So the supply of money is exogenously determined by central banks. Friedman's theory of the demand for money, he said that real money balances are some function of a large number of variables, and again it's reasonably stable. MDP is the demand for real money balances, MD is demand for money, P is the price level, Y is permanent income, not just current income, but income which is expected over an individual's or nation's life cycle. And Friedman criticised the Keynesian consumption by replacing it with his permanent income hypothesis. RB minus RM is the expected return on bonds minus the expected return on money. So differences between that will have some impact on the demand for money. RS minus RM, the expected return on stocks or equities minus the expected return on money. And pi E minus RM, the expected inflation minus the expected return on money. So all these factors will have some influence on money, but Friedman argued that generally the demand for money would be reasonably stable, although there would be some ripple effect through these different influences, although many times they would actually cancel out, or it would move fairly slowly to impact on money demand. Friedman's idea between the quantity theory and inflation. Milton Friedman has said many times inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, in a sense that it is and can only be produced by more rapid increases in the quantity of money than an output. So the general level of prices, in other words the value of money, will move with the quantity of money. The rate at which general prices grow will also depend upon the rate of money growth, but in the short run it will also depend directly on income velocity and inversely on output. So there may be some short run changes, but in the long run it's the quantity of money which determines the price level and the rate of change of prices or inflation. So Friedman's conclusion, based upon the stability of the demand for money function, is that the demand for real money balances, according to Milton Friedman, will increase when permanent income increases, which will not increase when current income increases. In other words, its permanent income will require quite a few things for it to increase. It will change reasonably slowly, which means that the demand for money function will be reasonably stable, and of course declines if permanent income declines. It increases when the expected return on bonds, stocks or goods increases versus the expected returns on money, but again this will change, not well, there will be some volatile periods, but generally it's fairly stable, which includes the interest paid on deposits and the services banks provide to depositors. Another view is the rational expectations view, which sees another role for money. Rational expectations is an enormous assumption, as Michigan says. It's equivalent to the efficient markets hypothesis in financial markets, which we'll look at when we look at stock markets. Milton Lucas replaced the adapted expectations hypothesis used by Friedman. Friedman thought that people would adapt their expectations to inflation and change behaviour slowly, although as inflation rose this would actually quicken. The rational expectations, on the other hand, believe that expectations will be identical to optimal forecasts, the best guess of the future, using all available information. So the expectations of any particular set of prices is based upon the optimal forecast of those prices. So expectations adjust very, very quickly to information. This means, in effect, that decision makers are looking at real prices, not nominal prices, and aren't fooled by short-term changes. So in the long run, money becomes neutral, as in the classical theory, because people are looking at real relative prices and are not fooled by changes in the price level. The question is, with all of these theories of money and macroeconomic theories, is how long is the long run? Keynes developed a liquidity preference theory of money, partly based upon the Cambridge cash balances approach. So this transformation of the three function of monies to the obviously medium of exchange, transactions, motives, the traditional use of money as a numeraire and a means of payment. Keynes actually in his work used labour as a numeraire, but it doesn't really matter. The precautionary motive. This is the store of value function of money. Money is a store of value. You need it in case something happens which is unexpected. Now both the transactions motive and the precautionary motive means that the demand for money will be a function of income. But Keynes added a speculative motive, which actually places the demand for money much more closely related to interest rates and returns on assets, particularly bonds, whereas Friedman just saw it as being a fairly smooth function of the returns on lots of assets. But Keynes argued that there's a distinct speculative motive. So the demand for money to Keynes and a Keynesian, let's say the Keynesian view, the quantity of money balances that people plan to hold depend on four main factors, which actually may change. So the demand for money may not be as stable as the monetarists, and Friedman in particular, looked at. One is the rate of interest. Another factor is the price level. Real GDP, real national income, and financial innovation. So let's look at the motives to hold money balances from this perspective. The demand for money is the desire to hold money balances or keeping wealth in the form of money rather than actually spending it on the goods and services, or using it to purchase financial assets like equities, bonds, or other financial assets. There's a transactions demand for money, which has a positive relationship with real GDP. As national income rises, economic agents will actually hold more money for transactions. Precautionary demand for money, again a positive relationship with real GDP, and with the level of uncertainty. As uncertainty goes up, the people will hold money more for precautionary means. Now let's add to this a speculative demand for money. There exists a negative relationship with the rate of interest in the price of bonds and expectations of future movements in the price of bonds. So let's take a typical bond like a gilt or United States Treasury, which has a fixed coupon rate of interest. There's an inverse relationship between the coupon rate of interest and the price of bonds. If the rate of interest, if the price rises, the yield on bonds falls. If the price falls of the bonds, the yield on bonds will actually rise. And of course, there's now expectations of what's going to happen in the future. If the rate of interest is high, this means that the price of bonds is low. Holding assets in the form of money has a high opportunity cost because there's zero income from interest, and this means that the speculative demand for money will be fairly low, and people will be putting their wealth into bonds because the price of bonds is fairly low. It's they're earning a yield, unlike holding assets in the form of money, and there's an expectation that the price will actually rise if interest rates fall. On the other hand, if the rate of interest is low, this means it's a high price of bonds. Holding assets in money terms has a much lower opportunity cost, so there will be a greater speculative demand for money, and of course there's an expectation that the prices of bonds will fall, so holding assets in forms of bonds is less profitable. Then there's a thing called the liquidity trap, which is worth looking at. This is when the interest rate falls so low that any increase in the demand for money will not necessarily have any positive increase on the demand for holding. So this is the speculative demand for money, which is downward sloping. It's negative with respect to the interest rate. When the interest rate is high, the speculative demand for money is low. If the interest rate is low, the speculative demand for money is actually high. And we can just read off different interest rates and different values for the speculative demand for money from the Keynesian perspective. So what is the liquidity trap we've just mentioned? The two kinds of liquidity trap. One, that banks are not lending despite any increase in money supply by the central bank, which reduce interest rates, a regulatory mistake, for example, caused by the capital excess capital ratios and stricter rules for banking business. And there is another possibility that firms and households don't want to invest or borrow money to spend. Again, there's no market for assets in the quantity theory. In the quantity theory, money market for assets isn't really considered. It is, of course, in the Friedman, but it's meant to just have a ripple effect. In this case, quantitative easing, as we've seen, is increasing the supply of money, but it's not leading to borrowing and investing behaviour. Keynes thought the liquidity trap was a theoretical possibility, but very unlikely to occur. He mentioned there's the possibility that after the rate of interest has fallen to a certain level, liquidity preference, in other words, the demand to hold your assets in the forms of cash, may become virtually absolute in the sense that almost everyone prefers cash to holding a debt, which yields so low a rate of interest. In this event, the monetary authority would have lost effective control over the rate of interest, so monetary policy would become ineffective. But whilst this limited case might become practically important in future, I know of no example of it hitherto. This is a remark by Keynes. Now, of course, liquidity traps have been seen to occur much more frequently in the period of quantitative easing. And Krugman argues a liquidity trap may be defined as a situation in which conventional monetary policies have become impotent, because nominal interest rates are at or near zero, as we now know they're becoming negative. So injecting into the economy, money into the economy has no effect, because monetary base and bonds are viewed by the private sector as a perfect substitute. And this is what a liquidity trap looks like. You have liquidity preference, the speculative demand for money. The gap is because of the precautionary demand for money, obviously in transactions demand. If the central bank increases the money supply, and assuming that the money supply is exogenous, or in that region reduces it, it is having no impact on the rate of interest. And having no impact on the rate of interest, it's having no impact on the desire to borrow money to spend or to invest. We've talked about the nature of money so far. Then we talked about the demand for money, whether or not it's stable. We discussed monetarism, Friedman, and the Keynesian idea of liquidity preference, where the rate of interest has a much more important impact on the demand for money than it does in the Friedman demand for money, where the rate of interest in respect to the rate of return on securities, debts, and other assets is only one of the arguments in a fairly stable demand function, where the main influence on the demand for money balances is permanent income. So let's now talk about the supply of the money, and obviously major question here is the supply of money exogenous? In other words, is it determined purely by the central bank, or is it endogenous? It's, in other words, the supply of money expands in relationship to conditions in the economy, some of which is in the central bank's control, some of which isn't. Well, let's look at legal and monetary concepts of the supply of money. Obviously, the legal tender part is in the bank's control of central banks. It's not an obligation for the issue of central bank money to keep the value effectively stable. As we said, the value of money depends on the inverse of the price level. But money, from the perspective of a government or a state, is a useful liquid debt instrument with no interest charged on that debt. Obviously, the possession of money has liquidity and solvency problems, and we will consider, of course, the creation of money by banks from a certain amount of liquidity. Well, money is the part of the portfolio of assets of individuals. We could approximate, say, some 10% of liquidity is maintained by some individuals. If liquidity is too high, people will spend it and raise prices, which is the basic idea behind the quantity theory. If the supply of money provides too much liquidity, this will then be passed on. Well, going down to the practical level, there are a number of definitions and measurement which differ in different countries, but generally what is called high-powered money, or M0, is the monetary base issued by the central bank. M4 is approximately notes and coins in circulation plus bank accounts. It's a wider definition of the supply of money. When money multipliers linking M0 and M4 were thought to be stable, in other words, if you increase the supply of the monetary base, higher powered money, there was supposed to be a stable relationship between that and the broader definition of money. Now, of course, that stability has broken down to some extent. That meant that policymakers' attention was really only focused on higher powered money, because that would lead through a money multiplier to a particular level of M4. Now the preference for explaining changes in money GDP, in other words the nominal value of GDP, if we know the real value, this is telling you what the price level could be, now is to focus on M4. Obviously, financial innovation complicates the measures of broader money, and use of broader money and monetary accuracy is used to explain changes across the economic cycle. Well, let's narrow down, just talk about the United Kingdom, and I suggest that you look at data from the Bank of England, definitions of M0, M1, M2, M3 and M4. M0 is coins and notes in circulation. M1 is M0 plus certificates of deposit, plus commercial paper, plus bonds, short-term bonds, floating rate notes and claims on repos of monetary and financial institutions, plus expected holdings of sterling bank bills, plus 35% of sterling holdings of monetary and financial institutions. M2, another measure, is M1, which is M0 plus all these, plus short-term deposits in bank, plus 24-hour short-term money market funds. M3, another measure, is M2, plus longer-term deposits and money market funds, and M4, the broadest level of defining money, is M3, plus other deposits. Finally, we'll look at some data. As we mentioned, the quantity theory is based upon the idea that there's a fairly close relationship between the money supply, high-powered money or even broad money in some versions of it, and the price level. In other words, as Friedman said, inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. Let's see what has actually happened. Now, if you look at using the United States data from 1950 to 2011, there was a fairly close relationship, which would give a high correlation. Of course, correlation doesn't mean causation, as you should know in economics and statistics, between the money supply M2 and the aggregate price level measured by the GDP deflator. This continued right up until the early to mid 90s. After that period, the money supply continues to increase, but this, as we know, is the period called the Great Moderation, when inflation does rise, but at a more modest level than had been seen in previous period. Now, some people believe this was because of the influence of independent central banks targeted inflation rather than targeting money supply growth. Having said that, we do see inflation, but the price level rises much less than closely in relationship with the money supply did before. Then, of course, we have the financial crisis, when the money supply falls, as we see in the red chart, but the aggregate price level falls even more, to rise again. And if these charts continued right up till current period stimulus and the stimulus as a result of the COVID-19, you would actually see a much bigger rise in the money supply, but again fairly subdued, and even possibly deflation in the price level. Now, some monetarists, including Tim Congdon of the International Monetary Research in Buckingham, argue that this is just storing up trouble, and there will be inflation as a result of this large money supply growth at some point. Some theorists, Keynesian theorists, believe in the idea of the liquidity trap, that money's being pumped into the system, but it is not being used to spend on real goods and services, sometimes asset inflation, but it is not feeding into inflation in normal goods and services. Again, the two different theories will be tested in the next couple of years. That is our at least introduction to money, demand for money, and the supply of money, and we'll be using these concepts more and more as a building blocks in the course. Thank you.